Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Tim Dalton, who's Director of Professional Services at BluJay Solutions. And today we're going to talk about current trends in the transportation market and how to respond. Now, one of my favorite bands is Oingo Boingo, and one of their song lyrics is, "We close our eyes and the world has turned around again." And those words certainly apply to the transportation market, and especially, this year in terms of what we saw at the beginning of the year, in the height of the pandemic, and now what we're seeing, today. So what is the current state of the transportation market? How might it change in the weeks and months ahead? And what action should shippers take to respond and prepare effectively to whatever direction the market takes moving forward here? So that's going to be the main questions we're going to address in today's program. And it's always great to have Tim on the program to kind of share his insights and perspective on this topic. So Tim, welcome back.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me back again. I appreciate the time and look forward to the session.
Great. So, obviously the pandemic has, been something that thrown a curveball to all businesses, and especially on the transportation side of things. But pandemic or not, the transportation market is always in constant change. So in many ways, transportation professionals, this is not new to them in terms of having to, have to deal with ebbs and flow in the market. So certainly there's been a lot of change, throughout the year. You obviously have a strong pulse on the market with the clients you work with and the carriers you work with. What's the current state of the transportation market right now as we speak, and particularly with regards to capacity and rates?
Yeah, no, I think you're correct. I mean, I think as you alluded to, the market itself is always cyclical. So a lot of the same conversations we're going to have today, we'll be able to have again in a couple of years, and we probably already had one once before. I think from a market standpoint right now, it's tight. Capacity is tightened up. Rates have been on the rise. At the beginning of the pandemic, beginning of the year, I think people were going into it thinking the worst, but then it stayed relatively soft, for many, many months. And then it almost seemed like out of nowhere, it really started to tighten up. So I think that, the reasons as to why, it really started to tighten up, they're kind of all over the place. For a while there was some more thought around, some of the unemployment benefits and, not being able to get drivers, for a short period of time. You were starting to hear more about hurricanes or potential hurricanes, which have, died down somewhat. And then especially with the pandemic related issues, that we've seen, a lot of it is always, and it has been, available driver. So whether, again, it's the unemployment benefits or other, I think that, for a lot of us during this pandemic, myself included, I'm probably buying more online than I have ever bought before. So you start to see, and I think I read before where, that the industry lost, 70,000 plus OTR drivers, since the beginning of this, but then over on the smaller e-commerce parcel type deliveries, those drivers have increased and almost have shifted that way. So I think we've seen an increase, a change there. I think there's been other disrupted freight flows or early on where there being such a depleted inventory, now we're kind of in the replenishment stage of it. So we're continuing to replenish, which is obviously creating more capacities. I've even heard from, I think, 2 different carriers that from what they're hearing from their shippers is that there's also, some impacts based on the election. So we're in election year right now. And, depending if there's a change in the White House, there's been some discussion around, COVID. And if the numbers continue to increase, then there might be a future shutdown again. So there's a lot of, customers that are starting to look to potentially, start to put their product closer to the consumer just in the event that, in the event that there was a shutdown. So, there's a lot of different factors that we've seen or that we've heard of that's impacting the market. Again, it is pretty tight right now, and I think from a contract to spot standpoint, especially when we start to look at rates, I was looking at some reporting this morning, and it looks like spot market. So we have an index at BluJay that we use based on all the transportation that flows through our system and our network. And we're seeing that year over year rates are up about 46% year over year, when comparing spot market rates to our BluDex rate or our index rate. And, there's some other, spot market usage as a whole is up, about 4% as of this past month, year over year. Variance to routing guides. So, going from your primary care, going down the routing guide, ultimately potentially going to the spot market. In that area, we're seeing anywhere from 6, 7+% increases year over year as well. And tender acceptance has definitely started to dip as well. So, definitely a pandemic or not, I think is how you started it. We've seen a lot of change. We've heard a lot of reason as to why there's the change, but all in all, the market's definitely tight. And I think a lot of folks are seeing it as it relates to just truckload capacity as well as the rate increases that they're seeing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, everything that you mentioned are things that I've been hearing from folks as well. I mean, I think there was just last week in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article talking about kind of the number of imports coming in through the West Coast ports, and how same thing, a lot of folks thought this was going to be, a disastrous year. And all of a sudden now, huge volumes, coming in, but that's creating some constraints because, a lot of backlogs now through the imports. And I think you're right. I think a lot of companies are now replenishing some of their inventory that they drew down. Some of them are bringing in more product as a risk from a risk standpoint,
Yep.
not knowing if, what may lie ahead in the months ahead, if there's another shutdown or not, or if there's continued economic growth or whatever the case might be. So I think, a lot of volatility, uncertainty, still in the market. I mean, do you, do you foresee these trends continuing in the weeks ahead? And, what factors will influence the direction, that rates and capacity will go, you think?
I definitely see them in continuing on in the weeks ahead. I think from a months or years standpoint, depending on who you talk to, depending on the publications that you read, it varies as far as, what folks are anticipating. And I think from what I've heard recently, or what I've read or heard most often, is, people are expecting the tightness to at least last the rest of the year. They start talking about 3 to 6 months. Some folks are talking summer 2021. But my guess is that it's going to be at a minimum, the rest of this calendar year, because even if things start to loosen a little bit again, well, then you're rolling into the holidays. And so I would anticipate that at a minimum, we're going to see this tightness at least for the rest of the year. But again, depending on who you talk to, depending on what you read, it could be anywhere from 3 months, 6 months, a year from now. But again, the majority of the things that I've read or heard from, it's probably at least the rest of the calendar year.
Right. Yeah,
And,
I think that's the general consensus too.
yeah, and again, I mean, sorry to go back to some of the influences. I mean, it's going to continue to be around COVID-19. Is there going to be that shutdown again that we've heard of before? The trend, the increase in online shopping. It's already continued to grow, over the years. And then, when people were at home, it just increased that much more, which has then taken some drivers from the OTR market. So, is that gonna continue to be at the levels that it's at? Is it going to slow down a little bit? Have the last few months really kind of set the stage as far as what we can expect moving forward from that increased online presence? And then again, it's always going to go political. I think also, there's been some discretionary, spending that folks have had, whether it's been with different stimuluses or what have you, or some of the unemployment benefits. So I think that's starting to kind of tailor off a little bit. And then, you continue to hear, talk about whether, are we headed towards recession? So, all of these different trends, are going to have a big impact of it. So, we talked at the very beginning of this call, you talked about how, the one thing that's, that we always have in transportation is change. It's no different now, but right now it seems like we're getting hit left and right with potentials, as far as, how the impacts could be.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a lot more variables and a lot of dynamic nature to all these variables that I think it makes it much more complex. So in light of all these variables, in light of all these unknowns, and so forth, I mean, how are smart shippers responding to these conditions? I mean, what actions are they taking?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think from a shipper standpoint, if what I've heard and it's what we've seen a lot of folks doing, if you want to look at it in some of its simplest form, it's how can we find ways to need fewer trucks? So, what is the likelihood of, increasing the likelihood of carriers taking their loads? So whether it's spreading out volumes, improving lead times, better utilization, et cetera. So, I think, one of the things that the shippers can truly control is what types of flexibility that can they offer to the carriers, because maybe it's better to wait on a primary carrier to pick a load up, 3 days from now, versus having to pay a very high rate to move it today. So I think from a shipper standpoint, we're seeing more of organizations really kind of getting those stakeholders in there, whether it's customer service reps, whether it's trans folks, whoever it may be, just to see, how can they become more flexible. So, if they can get a better rate but need to wait 2 days, they can potentially do so, or at least how to prioritize some of their shipments. Right now we're seeing some targeted bids taken on. There's folks that have already gone to market and maybe went to market not that long ago, but they're doing more targeted bids. So I think they're looking at it right now is, really trying to understand, are there certain regions or certain lanes that are, frequently hitting the spot market? And rather than continuing to put those out on the spot market, how can we take some of these lanes, reach out to core carriers, and if it's a higher rate than we've been paying, how can we look to move forward with a higher negotiated rate, which is still better than the uncertainty of hitting the spot markets. So a lot of folks are doing that. I think a lot of folks, as as a result too, whether it's a bid or not, or just reaching out to the core carriers, how can they work with their primary carriers to negotiate short-term rates? A lot of folks don't, the question you asked before is, how long is this going to last? Well, right now, nobody knows. So, rather than locking in for too long, how can we go and negotiate a 10% short-term increase to increase our tender acceptance, just to kind of get us through the next couple months, and and not necessarily try to look at it as an increase. But one of the problems I think folks get into right now is they start looking at it from an emotional state, where they look at the carriers, they look at their partners, and they're starting to see all these increases come back. And you can't help but there to be that level of frustration. But how can you put some of that emotion off to the side, work with your core partners, and if anything, at least try to listen to them, work with them, and maybe negotiate something in the short term to ensure that they're protected. Carrot shippers that maybe they've got a lot of swings as it relates to their shipping patterns. If a carrier's been awarded 100 loads a year, but then they've seen 100 loads a month the first month, how can we look at that and work with a carrier to say, all right, hey, you're gonna haul at your contracted rate until you you kind of fulfill your equipment, but maybe we can look at putting some sort of a surge increase for any loads above what you were awarded originally. I think from a digital broker standpoint, there's continues to be more conversation around digital brokers. So whether it's having APIs with your system set up to these brokers so you can kind of quickly dial rates in, I think there's been more conversation about that to really look at that, to understand that. Mode conversion, where I talked before about tender acceptance numbers and where those are at, putting stuff on the rail, we haven't seen the same type of impact with moving things intermodal. So is there an opportunity from a mode standpoint to convert over to do more intermodal, if your business allows it, versus more over, moving, over the road. So, and I think it's really just trying to look at all your spending, look at what you're doing on the spot market, take the emotion out of it, and really just try to look at, what are the lanes that you can really focus on that are going to offer the most benefit. Really kind of dig into those lanes, work with your partners, work internally to try to find those short-term solutions. So, it's across the board right now. I've even seen people doing daily RFPs just to kind of get, based on their available loads, just to get it out to a big group of carriers, just to get pricing that way. So it's really kind of across the board right now. But I think those shippers, the smart shippers, as you said, I think it's taking the emotion out of it, looking at the data, and having the data help you to determine where you should be hunting, to find the greatest opportunity, and just try to tackle as many of those opportunities as you can.
That last point you made, being kind of data driven, right? Kind of taking the emotion out of it. it sounds like obviously there's a lot of potential tools in that toolbox that shippers can take, um, to, address some of these, near term and perhaps longer term, challenges. I mean, I think you also talked a lot about, the importance, which we've always talked about, the importance of, honest, transparent communication, collaboration with your carriers, particularly those that are your strategic, partners. And again, you always get into that pendulum swinging back and forth. Is it a shipper's market? Is it a carrier's market? Is it a shipper's market or a carrier's market? And reality, it's our market, right? How do we both continue to find opportunities to make it a win-win for both of us? And we know that at times, it's going to require us to pay higher rates, but it's going to give us some capacity assurance. And at other times, we're going to be, able to get some, price reductions or cost reductions, and so forth. But I think, that's something that, walking the talk on communication and collaboration, I think it's more critical, than ever. And I think this is where, why there's so much investment in business intelligence and analytics, machine learning, and so forth, because it's these types of tools that are going to help, shippers and everyone in the ecosystem, make be able to find those opportunities that perhaps aren't they haven't explored in the past. So, and you touched upon this a little bit, because I mean, I think we're entering kind of the fourth quarter here. I think historically, a lot of shippers, whether it's in the fourth quarter or first quarter of the year, that's typically when they've put the freight out to bid, if you will, do some, freight procurement. I've kind of seen a move, I wouldn't say a move away from that, but certainly, the recognition that, once a year procurement engagement is no longer enough, or it's not a, it's not going to be going to lead to success, moving forward. So you mentioned some procurement strategies there. I mean, do you expect shippers and even carriers to change their approach to procurement moving forward?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I think that, and I think one of the things, just to kind of add one more thing to the last topic that we were talking about is, it's transportation, it seems like it's still one of those last areas that's really relationship driven. So the more that we can communicate and talk to our partners and try to find, that win-win solution. And, granted, you said shippers market, carriers market, it's our market, and really trying to get to that point, that's how a shipper and the smart shippers can really, find a way to benefit themselves. Because, the more that everybody's putting their freight out in a spot market, or not trying to solve the bigger issue, or, solve certain lanes, everybody's competing amongst themselves. So, for every one truck that's out there, you got X number of loads for that truck. So then, the more that we try to, solve the problems with kind of on a spot type basis, I think that's where you're really not going to get any relief from a costing standpoint. I think from a procurement standpoint, I'm still a true believer that, if you go to market once a year, continue to go to market once a year. One of the biggest things that a shipper can be is consistent to their partners. If you get down the path where you're starting to go out every month, or every 3 months or what have you, a carrier is going to know you're just fishing. And from a loyalty standpoint and from a partnership standpoint, they're not probably going to put too much stock into it. And then you also then have the potential of really disrupting carrier networks. If a carrier, if they're expecting to go from A to B 3 times a week, and then all of a sudden they lose that lane, then that has a ripple down effect that really can cause some other issues. So I continue to be a true believer in loyalty, consistency with the partners. Does that mean it's going to be exactly as it has in the past? Probably not. I think that some of the things that, some areas where we may see where the procurement process may change is, maybe you don't go out every year with your entire network. Maybe there's more work done ahead of time to really find out those lanes where you've got high tender acceptance, where it's obvious that the lane is important to the carrier. Maybe you work with those carriers early on just to kind of negotiate ahead of time to keep that carrier on the lane. Protect their network, protect your customers, because the carriers are already familiar with the nuances of that lane. And almost do some pre-negotiating on those lanes. So I don't know if it's going to be every lane, but I think there's going to be some more opportunities for targeted, some more work to be done ahead of time to remove lanes from the network. But as we've gone back, and as long as we continue to have the our market, your market instead of our market, you know, the next time it changes and it's going to be a shipper market, what shippers have experienced the last few months and what they're continuing to experience, they're going to go out to market and they're going to do everything they can to try to bring their rates down to recoup some of that money. And I don't think that means that they're going to completely change their networks or they're going to completely flip the script on their philosophies as it relates to asset brokerage mixes, etc. But I think there's going to be bidding that's going to take place because that's what folks do, and that's typically one of the tools in the toolbox where they can recoup some of that. So what I've seen over the last several years, which I've been pleased with, is I have continued to see that shift from a loyalty standpoint where, on every RFP that we do for folks, every shipper leaves money on the table because in most cases, it's more important for them to keep incumbents in place on lanes than it was maybe 10 years ago. So, again, from your procurement standpoint, long-winded way of, answering your question, but I think we're going to see some change. But it is still a relationship-driven market and relationship between a shipper and a carrier. I think the biggest changes that we're going to see, though, is the lanes that aren't included and kind of doing a lot more pre-work to eliminate those lanes.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think when you say, shippers leaving money on the table, yes, they're leaving money on the table from a purely a transportation standpoint as part of the procurement bid, because they understand that, these carriers are reliable, they're trustworthy, they meet the service expectations, because the flip side is, they've got to meet the requirements of, let's say, like a Walmart that's right now tightening their on-time and full requirements, right? So if they went with inexperienced carriers or carriers that are just, the cheapest ones, they may be saving on the transportation, but, they're going to pay for it big time, from a customer experience standpoint, from a penalty standpoint, and so forth at the back end. And ultimately, from a net perspective, they're going to lose more than just a few cents per mile, from a transportation standpoint.
No, and you're absolutely right. And I think that, in what we do, it's that carrier, that driver, there's no one more important, in that experience than that carrier or that driver. And for a lot of shippers, their carriers know their business better than they do. They know the nuance, they have the relationships with the folks at the dock. Even if they're running late, they can kind of call in their own favor and correct a lot of the different issues or mishaps themselves. So yeah, to have that carrier in place for a long time and really working with those carriers to protect your customers, it's worth its weight in gold. And again, you're absolutely right that when I mentioned money on the table, that was only related to, what is this carrier's rate versus this other carrier's rate? But there's all sorts of other expenses that can be incurred as a result of not having the right carrier on the right lane. So you're 100% right.
Yeah, and I mean, we've done some research in partnership with BluJay as well as CSCMP over the past 3 years on customer experience and innovation. And for 3 years straight now, the companies that have responded to our survey have said that absolutely, competing on customer experience is becoming the number one differentiator, and certainly transportation is a key enabler of being able to deliver an enhanced customer experience. And on the flip side, if it's a poor transportation operation, you're going to degrade the customer experience and your competitive any competitive advantage that you might have there. So what tools or capabilities can shippers use to help them navigate through this environment?
Market data. I mean, just data in general. And, I'm going to always go back to data. Data's key. Data's king. It allows you to take the emotion out of what you're seeing. So from a tool standpoint, obviously I work for BluJay Solutions. So, we've got tools that we offer as it relates to reporting or TMS or procurement solutions, et cetera. So it's really making sure you've got a good partner that you trust, but then are also just trying to be a student of the market as a whole. really understand what's going on in the marketplace and, communicate, what's going on in the marketplace ahead of time. Nobody wants like surprises. So to think everything is, going great and then all of a sudden the floor drops out, chances are there was a little bit of an indication that it was coming. So the more that you can understand data, because the data is going to allow you to really understand where you should be focusing your attention, to really understand what the market looks like. Are you doing better or worse? Work on your core carriers and continue to build and invest the time in the relationships with your carriers. You and I've talked before, and we've talked about, when people, I don't even know, when they say shipwright choice. Well, a lot of times they start talking about that when the market's really, really tight. So, again, you and I have talked before, how can you continue to treat your partner like a true partner year round? And as a result, your partners better be treating you that way as well. So, I think leveraging relationships, whether it's leveraging a relationship with your carriers, don't be afraid to go out to bid, even if it's a short term, because one of the conversations that I have with folks quite often is, they'll say, we don't want to go out with an RFP because we feel as if we go out to market with a bid, we're basically asking for a rate increase. And it's like, well, what are you paying right now in the spot market? You might be getting a rate increase based on what you were paying 6 months ago, but compared to what you're paying now without any stability, maybe there's an opportunity to just have current rates compared to what you're paying right now on a spot market. So from a tool standpoint, it's data, it's the partners that you work with. It's really, working with the company to have kind of that robust set of data that you can look at it and really allow that data to show you, areas where you are being successful in regards to the market and celebrate those successes, but then also where are those areas of opportunity that you should focus your attention on. It's, it kind of always goes back to, how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. I think that from an emotional standpoint, if you start to look at what's going on in the marketplace right now, it can be pretty overwhelming, as far as what do you need to do next, because all you're seeing is, loads sitting, no trucks on them, and your rates going through the roof and your service going down. So you really need reporting, you need data more than anything, just so you can really understand as far as where's the best place where you should be taking that bite, which is ultimately going to have the greatest impact and give you some successes to start to build some momentum.
You said something as part of your response there that leads me perfectly to my last question, which is, nobody likes surprises, right? And I think that's we learned that back in, I think, 2018, when all of a sudden CEOs and CFOs became aware of transportation management and the impact that transportation has on their P&L. And in 2018, just about every shipper's transportation spend was double digits above what they had forecasted or planned for, that year. So, as a way to wrap up, and as we head into, we're getting closer now to 2021. I mean, what should transportation executives be communicating to their CEO, to their CFO, in terms of what to expect with transportation in the weeks and months to come?
Yeah, no, I think, well, I said it, you hit it on the head again. Nobody likes surprises. So, as part of, all of our roles, one of our roles is also as an educator. So you need to understand that, maybe the CEO of your company, the CFO, they may not necessarily understand, the ins and the outs of transportation and how there's so much that can go into it. And once that market starts to turn, it's hard to get out of the way. So I think the more that, that transportation executive can be working with their carriers, kind of understanding from them what they're hearing, what they're seeing, talk to many of them, because you don't want to talk to one and hear that, because we've all had the conversations before where the world is coming to an end and, the rates are going to go through the roof, but then it doesn't happen. So I think the more that you can talk with many of your partners and really kind of understand what they're all saying, what they're thinking, and then start to pull out some of those consistencies among those conversations and use that information to educate the folks in leadership at your company is important. I'm always, like I said before, I'm always going to go back to data. So it's really understanding what the trends are and how are you doing in comparison to those trends. So right now, and I'm making up numbers right now, let's say the market, on average, the rates are up 10%. Okay, well, you look at your rates are up, but maybe they're up 5 or 6%. You're doing better than the market. and maybe those are areas where you should celebrate those. So, be able to provide some of that context, I think, is really going to help to educate the organization so they have the information to, to inform or educate those that they need to inform. So I think understanding how you're doing to market and really taking that approach year round. This isn't something you should only be doing now when the market starts to tighten. You should be doing it year round. So if the market's soft, understand the data, understand, how you're doing compared to the market, and maybe use it to help maybe there's some opportunities that you're not taking advantage of, or some areas that you could be doing better. But in this market, if you're beating the market right now, celebrate those successes, share that internally, try to find why it is that you're beating the market, and then try to replicate those further. So maybe it's because of the relationships you have with your partners. Maybe it's because of the drop lots that you have, or the flexibility that you have with regards to ship dates in order to get that key carrier on it. And I think the more that that trans executive can share the data, show how they compare to the market, show where some of the wins have been, and in those instances where maybe some of those wins are because of the flexibility that they have, or some of the issues that they're having is because of some of the flexibilities that they don't have. That's the way to then really get that executive leadership to really start to maybe push other departments or other areas as well, so everybody starts to see how working together internally can really make it can make a big difference overall. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, that by just sharing that information and being proactive. I think one of the things that we say a lot internally, and I'm sure others say as well, is bad news doesn't get better with age. So the more that that you can start to share that information, kind of provide that, hey, in the horizon there might be this blip, but we just wanted to bring it to your attention, and this is what I'm going to do in the meantime to try to combat some of these issues. The more that someone can really just communicate, use that data and get ahead of it, will only help the organization and help them personally. Because the one thing you never want to see, and what we tend to see, is when the market starts to tighten, you start to see where those trans managers or those trans executives, they're no longer at the company. And and that may be a good move for the company, but it may not be, because in a lot of ways you're starting all over again with your philosophies and the relationships that you have with your partners, etc. So how much of that could be averted if from the get-go you're communicating these potential issues with your executive leadership?
A lot of great points there. I think we've come full circle. I mean, we talked about the importance of data and understanding the data, and even getting beyond the numbers, right? So it's the numbers is one thing, but really understanding why those numbers are that way, right?
Yep.
What are the process enablers to that, or what are the process inhibitors, to that? So really getting into the numbers, into the data, and understand why those numbers are that way, and then communication and collaboration, both internally as well as with the partners. And that's laid between the data and those relationships and communication, and really lays a strong foundation to really navigate, whatever the future may hold. And obviously technology has a role here as well, in terms of helping to automate and streamline, a lot of the actions that you ultimately take in all of this. So, Tim, I'm sure that if we were to speak in, 3 months time, 6 months time, most of what we've talked about today will always hold true, but I'm sure that we'll find ourselves in a very different market, and there might be new things that we will be talking about there. That's just the nature of this market. But again, you provided some great insights and some great advice. So thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Yeah, no, and always, I mean, we've done this before together, and I always appreciate the time, to come to speak to you as someone from BluJay, just to kind of let everybody know what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're thinking. And, if we can ever help, you let us know.
Great. And I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the BluJay website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Tim, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again,
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks, Adrian.